This amendment improves the underlying resolution by examining the role of violent white extremism, misogynistic extremism, far-right extremism, and anti-government extremism and attacks on schools, school board members, and teachers. The rapid rise in violent rhetoric and far-right domestic terrorism in this country has affected schools by radicalizing school shooters, energizing conservative extremists to intimidate, harass, and assault school administrators, and emboldening COVID-19 conspiracy theorists to attack teachers and torment students. In 2020, 66% of domestic terrorist attacks were from white supremacists. In 2021, 28 out of 30 domestic terrorism murders were committed by far-right extremists. But my colleagues across the aisle want the world to think this problem does not actually exist. Rather than fighting domestic terrorists, they would rather paper over the stories of innocent Americans and their families who live in fear, and would rather point fingers at the Department of Justice. The underlying resolution is predicated on the fantasy that the problem is not far-right extremists attacking school board members, threatening teachers, and frightening children, but rather the Department of Justice somehow targeting nonviolent parents. Its supporters want you to forget the news stories, forget the evidence, and just listen to them. But no resolution blaming the DOJ can make the problem go away. It cannot undo the death threats or broken trust within communities. And it cannot erase the role of conservative media and far-right leaders in the fervor to physically and verbally bully school boards and teachers when civic discourse would be more appropriate. This amendment exposes the extremist ideology fueling many of the attacks on school officials. I encourage my colleagues to support it. And I will answer Mr. Bishop's question. If this amendment is approved, I will still oppose the resolution of inquiry, because the resolution of inquiry is so irreparable that even this amendment cannot repair it sufficiently as to justify support of it. I yield back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I oppose the amendment. First of all, I want to point out a striking dichotomy here. The underlying resolution is dealing with school boards, and the amendment itself is expanded to basically any kind of action with regard to schools. So, for instance, the Mesquite Elementary School kidnapping plot of Vail, Arizona, not Tucson, but of Vail, Arizona, had nothing to do with the school board. It had everything to do with three crazies who went into the principal's office and did not kidnap her, but threatened to kidnap her, and were promptly arrested by local law enforcement officials. That's really kind of what you would expect to happen, is that the local law enforcement would be involved instead of federal officials. And we do know that, indeed, the National School Board Association did ask specifically for use of certain federal officials to get involved here. That's not make-believe, contrary to what the gentleman from Rhode Island suggests. On page 2 of the September 29th letter, and by the way, this letter being written after there's been collusion with the Biden administration and the NSBA, they specifically asked and said, quote, NSBA specifically solicits the expertise and resources of the U.S. Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Secret Service, and its National Threat Assessment Center. That's what they asked for. They didn't ask. They went beyond that. And why did they go beyond it? Because they also wanted the use of the Patriot Act, the next paragraph down. So when the gentleman from Rhode Island says they didn't do that, it's right in the letter. It's right in the letter. They want the federal government to impose and use the Patriot Act against parents who go to school board meetings. And what do we find out later from whistleblowers? Indeed, and this is, by the way, has been widely reported, except for by CNN and MSNBC, but it's been widely reported otherwise, that they used threat tags on parents who showed up at school board meetings. And why were the parents showing up at school board meetings? Protesting CRT and COVID-19 restrictions. That's why they were there. Now, what else do we know? We know that on September 29th, That's when the NSBA sent their letter, but that they had been in negotiations with the Biden administration before that ever happened. And I know that we heard AG Merrick Garland saying that, oh yeah, you should be allowed to protest, et cetera. We would never hinder it. Why do we know he said that? Because I was asking them questions to that effect. And he said, no, we don't view that as a terrorist threat. But we also had another attorney general from one of the districts in Washington State testify in one of my committees that they had been briefed. Yeah, they had been briefed on this, and they needed to be alert and aware of this. So the point is, we should be transparent here. This amendment doesn't get at the underlying amendment, and basically, we've already been told that the people who are supporting, that introduced the amendment, are not going to vote for the resolution even if the amendment gets on. So this is just a red herring, trying to change the very nature of the underlying resolution, which actually would provide us with the information that I think Americans would love to see and hear about, and that is the federal government's police apparatus spying on parents who do protest and have a right to First Amendment activity. Because if there's one thing that I agree with Merrick Garland on, it's that parents have the right to show up at school board meetings and protest and express themselves when they either agree or disagree with school board decisions, policies, and rhetoric. And I just want to close out by saying this. When I heard the chair and then the sponsor of this amendment talk about inflammatory language or inflammatory rhetoric, that's quoting each of them. One said inflammatory language, the other one said inflammatory rhetoric, and that it is extremist or radical to foster and go forward with this resolution. I just find it interesting, because I find that there's radical rhetoric coming from the other side, including in those statements in and of themselves. When you start accusing people of radical rhetoric, you ought to look in the mirror. I yield.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in support of this amendment, and I seek to set the record straight. January 6, 2021 will never be forgotten, an infamous day in American history. MAGA Republicans descended upon the Capitol, engaged in an insurrection. They occupied the Capitol. 5 people were killed, hundreds injured, including hundreds of Capitol Hill police officers attacked and bludgeoned. It was a day that we'll never forget. And people on the local level at affected school board meetings, they won't forget the MAGA Republicans descending on their school board meetings after January 6th, like January 6th, disrupting meetings. It was a coordinated attack happening across the country. Americans won't forget about it. School board members, teachers, administrators subjected to violence, threats of violence, harassment, intimidation. And in response to that, the National School Boards Association sent a letter to the Biden administration seeking federal help. Things had gotten so far out of hand. And by the way, there's not one scintilla of evidence, either direct or indirect, that there was any coordination between the Biden administration and the National School Boards Association that caused that letter to be sent seeking federal assistance. And so in response to that request, Attorney General Merrick Garland sent a memo that is the subject of proceedings today in the Judiciary Committee, sent the memo indicating that there was going to be some coordination between the federal government and local governments to maintain order at school board meetings. And this was a coordinated attack on local school boards, the same way as the attack on January 6th. The same dark moneyed interests behind January 6th were behind this attack on school board proceedings across the country. It got to the point where even in my state, in my home state of Georgia, Cecilia Lewis was hired to a school district to serve as a diversity administrator. Nowhere in the description of her role or in her plan for the district was critical race theory ever mentioned. But Ms. Lewis, being a qualified contender for the job, accepted the position in the hope of making the district better for all of the students. Rather than welcoming her, parents in the district stalked and threatened her. They posted her location to Facebook. Once they had driven her out of her job, they followed her to her next job. They spread lies and rumors, making blatantly false claims about her plans for the district. These were MAGA Republicans. They made it their mission in life to make sure that this hardworking and qualified woman never found a job in education again. Ms. Lewis is only one of the many educators across the country who have been put in danger, intimidated and threatened and harassed due to MAGA Republican lies and hysteria. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle are more concerned with the parents who harass educators than they are about educators getting harassed. While our schools face a rising number of school shootings, failing infrastructure, lack of resources, and low salaries, among other things, my colleagues have decided that the educators who teach our children in the public schools, teach them about their multiplication tables, how to read and write, those are the enemy. 8% of the teachers are deciding to leave the profession every year, and we should be focused not on causing them to leave, but on supporting them, not villainizing them. They need our help. Discourse and dissent are important aspects of democracy, but harassment and threats are not. And this resolution will not help anybody. I'll again say that even the NSBA, which sought help, was forced after being intimidated and harassed and threatened to rescind their letter and apologize for even sending it. That's the level of violence and harassment and intimidation that this dark money directed at local school boards and their representatives.
Gentleman's time has expired.
With that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does Ms. Fishbach seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield my time to Mr. Bishop.
I thank the gentlelady. Not only was the memorandum that Attorney General Merrick Garland ultimately issued coordinated with the White House, not only was the White House in coordination with the National Association of School Boards to do that, which Mr. Johnson just did, or a gentleman from Georgia just did exactly what is being done over and over and over. He characterized the National Associations of School Boards' subsequent analysis, independent investigation, and report on its own coordination with the White House. He says that report, or that admission and the retraction of their letter, was because of threats. He's doing exactly what's being done over and over and over, and what this resolution of inquiry seeks to fully uncover from the White House. Mr. Roy cited the example from Loudoun County. The chairman a moment ago cited Loudoun County as an example of a threat. Mr. Roy illustrated and provided great detail on how there was no threat. There was a parent who became unruly after a board member did unspeakable things to him in terms of a tragedy that his family had suffered. You characterize that as a threat so that you may justify putting criminal law enforcement forces on it. Same thing with the example that the chairman recited out of Orange County, North Carolina. I've pointed out already that there was no threat, but the article there goes further, describing what The chair of the board there talked about Proud Boys protesting at one of their meetings and a subsequent protest outside. She sought to criminalize that. The Democratic sheriff of Orange County, North Carolina, Orange County Sheriff Charles Blackwood, said no laws were broken. As the Proud Boys were on DOT right-of-way and not on school property, he said, while disrespectful, side note, exactly like the chanting I heard last night at the pro-life event. Back to the language here. Even though, he said, while disrespectful, their language did not go outside the bounds of free speech protected by the First Amendment. And yet, the Biden White House reaches out to the School Boards Association, says, among other things, be sure to put this stuff about the Patriot Act in your letter asking us for action, which they're going to get from the Attorney General of the United States, and indeed they did. And then months later, in the subject of a resolution of inquiry, the Democratic chairman of the Judiciary Committee characterizes all this again as being threats that justify the Attorney General's actions. How extraordinary. You know what you need? The gentleman from Georgia and the others who have spoken about white supremacists and MAGA threats, you need some red lights sort of on the walls behind you. You need to get sort of like the red speech, you know, the one the president gave, where he declared half of the country to be domestic enemies. You really need the red lights. Those add something. They add a real image that you would definitely want to look at.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
It's not my time to yield. It's the gentlelady from Michigan. Is that right? Minnesota. Sorry.
Would the
But I think the gentleman from Texas might have some more to add about the National Association of School Boards coordination with the White House.
And Mr. Chair, I would yield time to Mr. Roy.
I think the gentlelady, I think the gentleman from North Carolina. I would just add, very specific in response to the gentleman from Georgia's assertion that there, I think was, quote, not a scintilla of evidence of coordination. That was the gentleman's quote, not a scintilla of evidence. That in an article that I'd asked to, made part of the record from Fox News, quote, in the September 14th, 2021 meeting of the NSBA Organization of State Association Executive Directors Liaison Group, they were informed there had been a meeting with White House staff that morning and that NSBA was preparing to send a letter to the president. Subsequently, on September 17th, the interim ED emailed notice to the State Association Executive Directors that indicated a letter requesting federal assistance would be sent. Another email exclusively sent to Fox News revealed that the NSBA had discussed the issues with the White House for weeks and that they altered the text of the letter to satisfy the curiosity of White House staff. Finally, in talks over the last several weeks with White House staff, they requested additional information on some of the specific threats, so the letter also details many of the incidents that have been occurring.
Those are Fox News reports?
I yield.
I yield to Mr.
Fox
Bishop.
News?
That is the epitome of politicizing criminal justice.
And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The time of the gentlelady's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I'm going to start my remarks by showing a video of a little over a minute, and then I'm going to discuss what you're about to see on this video. If staff could play the video, that'd be great.
The heated debate over masks is escalating into physical altercations in various states across the nation. In Texas, a parent ripping a teacher's face mask during a Meet the Teacher event Monday, according to Eames School District Superintendent Tom Leonard.
Let's just leave the mask wars out of the schools.
In a letter to parents and staff, Leonard calling it a physical assault on a teacher by a parent.
So you want to fight those wars, fight them somewhere else, but don't mess with the teachers. They have a hard enough job right now.
In Northern California, an elementary school teacher was hospitalized last week after a parent attacked him during a verbal argument over face masks, a district official says.
It was originally between the parent and the principal, and the teacher intervened at that point. The female principal intervened to say, hey, it's time to go. Like, you stop.
The teacher was stitched up for cuts and lacerations to his face. Police responded to the scene and are investigating. The parent was not arrested. The superintendent there sending a letter to parents saying assaulting a staff member will never be tolerated on any school campus.
multiple teachers have been assaulted and exposed to threats of violence. A teacher was sent to the hospital by a parent who physically assaulted him. I don't care if you're a MAGA Republican or a member of the Red Cross. You do not have the right to engage in violence or threats of violence. I'd like to thank Congresswoman Mary Gay Scallon for her service as a school board member and all school board members across America. My wife is also a school board member, and last year, during the height of the pandemic, she received death threats so severe that the police department opened an investigation. Shame on any MAGA Republican who defends violence or threats of violence. Shame on any MAGA Republican who believes that it's okay to physically assault a teacher or school board official or school board member or have violent threats directed at them. Shame on any MAGA Republican who wants to intimidate law enforcement from investigating violence or threats of violence. Shame on any MAGA Republican who wants to intimidate the Department of Justice from investigating violence or threats of violence. Shame on any MAGA Republican who wants to promote chaos over community. Haven't we already had enough political violence in our country? I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks, for what purpose does Mr. Gomer, the gentleman from Texas, seek recognition?
Just strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. It's very difficult to hear colleagues across the aisle saying things that we know are not true. And it's to say this is made up, we've heard it. And you know, this is from the report of the National School Board Association, the one that did coordinate with the White House. Their own report, these are Democrats, that's why they worked with the Biden White House. But on May 20th, 2022, the National School Board Association released a report that it had commissioned to examine these events. And the report offered new evidence on how the Justice Department coordinated with the White House to target parents. The report found that the first communications between the NSBA and the White House occurred on September 9th, and that the Biden White House closely coordinated with the NSBA on its letter to President Biden. On September 21st, 8 days before the NSBA letter, Mary Wall, a senior policy advisor to a man known as President Biden, emailed NSBA's interim CEO and executive director, Chip Slavin, asking, is there any way we can take a look at the letter in advance of release? In specific, I'm meeting with colleagues from other White House offices and the DOJ tomorrow morning. I mean, I don't know. Maybe somebody here knows Mary Wall and considers her an absolute liar constantly, but this was what the report found from the NSBA was asking for coordination. And anyway, she says she'd like it tomorrow morning to see if there might be any options we can pursue here. So if you have concrete recommendations in your letter, e.g. the threat assessment you mentioned, it would be good to know so I can include it in discussions. In response, Slavin emailed Wall a detailed summary of the contents of the letter, which included specific language about the Patriot Act and the use of, and wait for it, quote, domestic terrorism tools. The NSBA Commission report concluded, quote, the White House officials discussed the existence of the NSBA letter, its requests, and the contents of the letter with the Department of Justice officials more than a week before the letter was finalized and sent to President Biden. In other words, Justice Department officials knew that the NSBA would encourage President Biden to invoke the Patriot Act and domestic terrorism resources against parents. And I want to echo my colleague across the aisles. comments about violence. And I have so many people say, you know, they call us liars. Scott Smith was called a liar for truthfully saying his daughter was sexually assaulted. And he was called a liar, and it provoked him to violence, it appeared. And I just want to say that we cannot allow provoking words to cause people to resort to violence. We cannot be baited into that. Nobody should do that. And at times, it occurs to me, are these people calling us liars when we have the truth right in front of us to try to provoke violence again so that they can shut us down for good, arrest more people? Why do they keep saying things are not true that we have proof they are true? It's quite disconcerting, but I come back to this. We are to use the tools peacefully, as Dr. King found. The Weather Underground with violence didn't accomplish anything. Then they went to our universities, got tenured, started teaching teachers about how to teach Marxism in the school. And we cannot allow, no matter how bad things get, cause conservatives, parents concerned about their kids to resort to violence. Don't take the bait, no matter how many times Democrats call you liars. We know the truth, and we would encourage our colleagues to admit the truth, and we can work things out much more peaceably. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Let me rise in very strong support of the gentlelady from Pennsylvania's amendment to the Resolution 1238 that shocks me by its premise. Shocks me by its premise. I think Mr. Lieu has provided us with a visual, but those of us who've been in our various communities know that parents are loving and put their children first. Nothing in the administration, Department of Justice, characterized parents as terrorists. What was done is that as every child should be safe in their schools, and we had an incident in my district yesterday, thank God all are safe and that it was a hoax, but you should see the video of our children scurrying because they felt that there was, not felt, that heard that there was an active shooter. We want nothing but safety for our children, nothing but safety for our teachers and teachers' assistants, principals and otherwise. Know that by what is going on in Uvalde. But to have a resolution to even cast aspersions to suggest what this administration is trying to do to characterize parents in a certain way, look to the data of what is happening and what happened to school boards, universities, public educational institutions, employees dealing with violent extremism. That is the gentlelady's thought. If you want to get some information, as is evidenced in HRES 1238, let us find out the kind of evidence of threats towards school boards, school boards, universities, public educational institutions, and their employees, inspired by violent extremism, misogynistic extremism, far-right extremism, or anti-government extremism, including Mesquite Elementary School kidnapping plot and the Oxford High School shooting. Or even to think of the moment when President Trump publicized, exaggerated, a legitimate, lawful entrance to his compound that had refused to abide by the law. Listen to these words. The FBI and the Justice Department have become vicious monsters controlled by radical left scoundrels, lawyers, and the media who tell them what to do. You people right there, and when to do it. They're trying to silence me, and more importantly, they're trying to silence you, but we will not be silenced. Vicious monsters. And what happened? A disturbed soul showed up, infused by the poison of this past president at an FBI office, and tragically, he is dead. How many more are going to jump out of the woodwork, moved by this kind of attitude? I ask unanimous consent to place this in the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to place the timeline the Justice Department criminal inquiry into Trump taking classified documents to Mar-a-Lago.
Without objection.
And the relevance of it? The relevance is that we in the federal government are not perfect. But there's a whole litany of dates: fall 2021, January 2022, February 9, 2022, February 18, 2022, April and May 2022, when the appropriate process was utilized to work with the former president. April 29, 2022, May 1, 2022, May 10, 2022, May 11, 2022, May 12, June 2nd. And the issue is that as long as we keep promoting that the government is an enemy of the people, as long as we call law enforcement vicious monsters, then you are creating the atmosphere that permeates over into the innocent place of where we teach children, the innocent place of teachers who want to do nothing but come to school and have beautiful crafts and artwork. I know, because I have 7-year-old grandchildren, their greatest joy is to come home and show their spelling bee or spelling paper with an A on it, or their drawings. Calmness, harmony, and the administration's calmness, harmony, and the school board's investment in our children. And so to suggest that the Department of Justice wanted to do anything but just ensure that harmony and peace could go on, and that school boards would not have to get armed guards to protect them in the board meetings, because some had bought into the very language of the former president that FBI are vicious monsters and we are an enemy of the state, your government is an enemy of the people. Stop it. This amendment to this underlying resolution, which I absolutely oppose, is a vital evidence that there was reason to begin to ask the hard questions. I ask my colleagues to support the gentlelady's amendment and to oppose the underlying resolution. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purposes Mr. Tiffany seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So once again, we have a drive-by shaming that's happened in the room here. Someone comes in, the gentleman from California in this instance, comes in and says shame on MAGA Republicans. And you can see it. You can see the shiny ball at this point. It's repeat MAGA Republicans enough, and then the American people won't pay attention to the lawlessness on the southern border, which has virtually been erased. They won't focus on the crime that's happening across America. In my state, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I mean, it's just completely out of control. Does not want people focusing on that and doing this shaming. Let's be real clear. I know I've been consistent, and I believe my colleagues over here have been real consistent about this. We have denounced violence of all types. And yet, I don't hear the gentleman from California. I have not heard once where he has denounced the violence that happened in the summer of love of 2020. I mean, the country was on fire. I think about Madison, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Kenosha, Wisconsin. We saw it on our TV screens happening day after day right next door in Minneapolis. And yet, there's no denouncement of that violence that was committed. And let's be real clear. We should all denounce all violence of that sort rather than trying to do these drive-by shamings in a committee like this. I yield to the gentleman from Texas.
I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin. I would just respond to the gentleman from Georgia who was scoffing at the citation of Fox News, which was quoting actual emails. So I'm going to insert those into the record. And I would ask that we be able to insert into the record the email from Mary Wall in the Executive Office of the President, referencing and saying, attached, please find an internal, saying, thanks for the heads up. Is there any way we can take a look at the letter in advance of release? And the response from the National School Board Association Executive Director saying, find the internal NSBA document attached. We use this document as a reference point. A follow-up memorandum from Viola Garcia to the State Association officers and executive directors in which she references the September 14th meeting that the Fox article referenced, meeting at the liaison group, that they were informed there had been a meeting with White House staff that morning and that NSBA was preparing to send a letter to the president. And then later that in response to the letter sent by NSBA on October 4th, the Attorney General announced in a memorandum widely shared throughout the U.S. Department of Justice that he was ordering all U.S. attorneys' offices, et cetera, et cetera. I would ask that these be inserted into the record. Because
Without objection.
These are the actual facts. That's what actually matters. and you have a news account on Fox News being scoffed at, but these are the facts of what happened in the direct and clear coordination between the NSBA, the White House, that then resulted in action by the Department of Justice issuing a memorandum that is still in place as we speak. And I would yield to the gentleman from Wisconsin to yield to the gentleman from Ohio.
Yeah, I just want, if I may continue.
Sure.
You know, I think about, it was cited that the USA Today gave this definitive article saying that, geez, this stuff just did not happen. Well, let me tell you about PolitiFact. Just recently, we showed that PolitiFact was completely wrong from a year ago when we exposed what happened with the evacuation from Afghanistan, where it was said, yes, these people were vetted. Well, it's clearly being shown by Inspector General's reports that that did not happen. We went back to PolitiFact and said, hey, you want to correct your story because it's proven that how you rated my statements as mostly false, they are true at this point. And we've been showing that, nah, we're not going to deal with that at this point. So you can cite that if you want to, but we've seen time after time how they don't get the facts correct, including with what happened in Afghanistan with the disastrous withdrawal, and now we've got a huge national security concern as a result of it. I yield to the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I want you to go back to the memorandum that the Attorney General issued on October 4th of last year. Very first sentence. In recent months, there's been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, staff who participate in the vital work of running our nation's public schools. When he testified, when the Attorney General testified, we asked him a simple question. What was the basis for you putting that first sentence in your memorandum? And what did he say? What did he say? He said it was the letter from the National School Boards Association that they have now said we regret and apologize for sending. The letter, as the gentleman from Texas just pointed out, they coordinated with the White House to use the words domestic terrorism in the letter and cite the Patriot Act. That's why we want the correspondence back and forth, in addition to the few emails we've been able to uncover, because it was all coordinated, and it was based on that coordinated letter that the Attorney General of the United States writes that first sentence. There was no other evidence. I'm going to take the word of a left-wing political organization that's been in cahoots with the White House to put this together because we think it's going to be to our political advantage. They found out it wasn't, and Glenn Youngkin's now the governor of Virginia because of it. But that's what they did. We want all the communications between the White House, the NSBA, and the Justice Department that put this whole scheme together.
I yield.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Would the gentleman yield?
For what purposes, the gentleman from from California seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
And I'd offer to yield time to the gentleman from Texas.
I thank the gentleman from California. I would add, in addition to what the gentleman from Ohio was just discussing, that what we have in the form of the underlying resolution of inquiry is specific language that is, I would say, general in its nature of suggesting we want to know the truth of what was going on with the correspondence among the highest levels of the Executive Office of the President, the Department of Justice, that relates to the correspondence with the National School Board Association. There are no quotes in this resolution of inquiry. There are no specific allegations. There is simply a request for the information of the correspondence back and forth, because that's what we do when we want to conduct oversight. That's what we do, rather than having to rely on outside organizations using the Freedom of Information Act to get the actual email correspondence, which we're just inserting into the record. We'd like to see the rest of it. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania offers this amendment, an amendment which goes through and offers alleged quotes. I'll take at the gentlelady's words and from some record that these quotes are accurate. I don't know, but you're inserting into the record alleged quotes. It doesn't say alleged, by the way. They just assert the quotes. And the gentlelady acknowledged the gentleman from North Carolina that she has no intention of supporting the underlying amendment or the underlying
The gentleman
bill.
yield for a moment?
Briefly.
Okay.
If she'll answer that question, will you support the underlying bill?
No, I don't support the underlying resolution
So
because
this
I
is a
think
red
it's
herring.
misguided. No, if by some reason it should pass, then I think it should be amended to reflect the fact that there were legitimate concerns,
And reclaiming my time, the underlying resolution of inquiry is asking for specific correspondence among the highest level decision makers. The gentlelady knows specifically why she's putting these quotes in there, so that she can make a political stunt rather than seeking truth. I'd be fine including that amendment, even though I think it's clearly designed to be biased, if the gentlelady would support the underlying measure, which she does not, and clearly does not. At the end of the day, the American people know what's going on here. Parents being targeted by federal officials, parents being targeted by the evidence in front of us of a direct coordination between and among, frankly, the White House, the Department of Justice, and the National School Board Association, which the gentleman from Georgia glosses over and decries as political. The National School Board Association memorandum from October 22nd, 2021, which should be inserted in the record if it has not been, in which they say, we regret and apologize for the letter. To be clear, the safety of school board members and other public officials, educators, and students are a top priority. However, there was no justification for some of the language included in the letter. We should have had a better process in place. And it retracts the letter. You have 30 state school board associations which have distanced themselves from the National School Board Association, 26 of which they've withdrawn, flat out withdrawn from affiliating with the National School Board Association. That's a majority of the states of the United States of America in which their state school board associations have withdrawn from affiliating for the clear political engagement of this organization with this White House to target parents that yield to the gentleman from California, to yield to the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time. You know, I know there's been a lot of the word shame used here, but shame on everyone in this room if they are not sincerely looking for the truth. And it appears as though there are a number of people who are not looking for the truth, and that's the reason that I predicted earlier, and I predict again, that we will not see any of these resolutions allowed to seek the truth. And with that, I would yield to the gentleman from Texas briefly.
I come from a family of teachers. In fact, my mother was my 8th grade English teacher in a public school. But we've heard repeatedly from people across the aisle about the paragons of virtue that are all teachers. Most are. But I've also heard a woman who was saying, a young woman, that her life basically devastated because middle school teachers were telling her, if you ever look in the mirror and you're not pleased with what you see, then it means you're transgender. And she bought that, and it upended her life. And eventually she came back to being straight and realizing she was manipulated by teachers. And again, I would encourage people not to be provoked to violence, because the law has been and still is, provoking words are never a defense to a physical assault. Do not get provoked to violence, no matter how bad the words are.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Jones seek recognition? Mr. Owens seek recognition?
I'd like to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to give my time over to Ms. Tiffany.
I want to thank the gentleman from Utah. I want to go back and put a finer point on what the gentleman from Texas, just to my left, made in his comments. Of inquiry requesting the president to provide certain documents to the House of Representatives relating to the October 4, 2021 memorandum issued by the Attorney General entitled Partnership Among Federal, State, Local, Tribal, and Territorial Law Enforcement to Address Threats. It is so straightforward. This is just purely sunshine. This is what it's part of the purpose of this committee, from what I understand, is to provide sunshine to the American people. I did not get a chance to comment on the previous bill that was before us. That was even more simple, the request there. It's simply to ask for the copy of the affidavit. That was it. That's it. I mean, people are trying to muddle here what is being requested here. It is very straightforward, and it's documents the American people should see, because the American people are very fair at their foundations. Most American people, they just want, put the truth before us, and we'll make our conclusions from there. And yet we have this denial that's happening today and this obfuscation about what is being requested here today. It is very simple. Produce the documents that you have written in the administration and let the American people see them. Obviously, they have something to hide. I yield back to the gentleman from Utah.
I yield my time to Ms. Jordan. Yes.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just, again, the basic facts here is, I think, so plain. We know there was coordination prior to the letter ever being sent to the President of the United States between the White House, the School Board Association, and some element at the Justice Department. So they send the letter. 5 days later, the Attorney General of the United States issues a memorandum. The first sentence of the memorandum cites we're concerned about the intimidation and threats that are going on there. When he testified in front of this committee, we asked him what was the basis for the very first sentence in the memo that set up this apparatus that has now resulted, based on what whistleblowers have told us, over 24 parents being investigated by the FBI. We asked him what was the basis for that first sentence, and he said, the letter. The letter that has now been rescinded, apologized for, regretful, all kinds of, they can't backpedal enough. The letter that prompted this all, that caused more than half the states to leave this organization, that's all happened. And oh, by the way, here's another fact that I think is important. The two people who signed the letter from the National School Boards Association, the CEO is gone. The other individual got a plum assignment on, what's this? The National Assessment Governing Board. Joe Biden appointed her to that board, a board with only 5 people on it. She got appointed to that board on October 13th. So what's that? 9 days after the memorandum, based on the letter that she had sent. Well, shazam, that sounds kind of scary, kind of unnerving to me that all happened. And so what do we have here? We have a resolution saying we'd kind of like to know all the other facts, all the communication going on between these folks that started this whole scheme to harass, and we know what they were trying to do. They were trying to, this is about First Amendment, chill the speech of moms and dads. And they thought, we all know this, they thought, because the gubernatorial candidate in Virginia said this, they thought it was going to help them win the Virginia governor's election. That's what they thought. Now, they thought wrong. Turns out, when Democrats say we think government is actually smarter than parents, lots of moms and dads say we disagree. And in Virginia, they said it in a big way on Election Day. But all this resolution, as the gentleman from Texas has pointed out, as so many of the members on this side have pointed out, is simply asking for, show us that communication, that we've sent countless letters. I mean, I don't know how many letters we've all signed to the AG, to the school boards, to the Justice Department, to everyone, to the we've sent them to we sent them to the Secretary of Education, and we've gotten zero information back. You would think this committee would want to get, as the gentleman from Wisconsin just pointed out, a little sunshine, a little transparency. That's, after all, our job. I would yield back. Thank you, the gentleman, for yielding.
I yield back.
For what purposes does Mr. Johnson seek recognition?
Move to, for the purpose of being able to introduce into evidence or into submission before this committee a final report on the events surrounding the National School Boards Association's September 29th, 2021 letter, wherein it is established that the letter there was no evidence of any coordination by the administration and the National Association of School Boards or any of its...
Mr. Chairman, and what time is
that objection? Who seeks recognition?
Well, Mr. Can I ask a point of clarification? I didn't understand the gentleman from Georgia. Who made that assertion? Who was the report?
In the final report of the events surrounding the School Boards Association by the firm hired by the association to conduct an investigation and get to the bottom of what happened. And they found that there was...
Clearly disinterested.
That there was no... Yeah.
The gentleman...
So the report is now in the record for the public perusal.
Who seeks recognition? If there are no further speakers, for what purpose does Mr. McClintock seek recognition?
Thank you.
To speak on the amendment?
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I mean, Mr. Chairman, what the Democrats seem to be saying here is that speech is violence. This fiction is then used to justify suppressing speech that they don't like. That's the crux of this discussion. Speech is not violence. Speech can be hateful, it can be disgusting, it can be bigoted, it can be false, but unless it is specifically and overtly inciting violence, our society has always tolerated it, confident that such speech can best be countered and corrected as long as everyone else is free to speak their minds. Kinder sentiments will always triumph over hateful ones. Truth will always triumph over lies. Sound opinion will always triumph over folly. You know, there used to be a common expression, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names can never hurt me. There was another, I might despise what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. These sentiments are the principles of a free society. And I've made this point before. There are only two possible ways to resolve conflicts among us human beings. There's reason and there's force. We've built an empire of reason where people, all people, can express their opinions freely without fear of retribution by their government. Those who spew hate or folly or lies will naturally be contained by those who offer better sentiments, not by force, but by reason. People can hear all sides and draw their own conclusions, and we've based our entire form of government on the assumption that they will usually and ultimately will always arrive at just and sound conclusions. Our government was formed to protect this fundamental right of individuals to express their own views and the fundamental mechanism of democracy, which is to test all opinions, hold them up to every possible light, and then arrive at a common conclusion for our society. The worst thing that we can do is to suppress speech or punish people from expressing their opinions. Churchill spoke of such societies. He said they're afraid of words and thoughts. Words spoken abroad, thoughts stirring at home, all the more powerful because forbidden, terrify them. They make frantic efforts to bar out thoughts and words. They are afraid of the workings of the human mind. A state of society where men may not speak their minds, where children denounce their parents to the police, where a businessman or small shopkeeper ruins his competitor by telling tales about his private opinions. Such a state of society cannot long endure if brought into contact with the healthy outside world. He was speaking of the oppressions of the European dictatorships of the age, and the healthy outside world he was speaking of was ours, that beacon of freedom and liberty that is founded on the most fundamental right of every citizen to express himself. So I say again, speech is not violence. Only dictatorships treat it as violence, and they do so as an excuse to silence dissent and impose their opinions not by reason, but by force. That is antithetical to the principles of the American founding. I yield to Mr. Roy.
Would Mr. Roy yield for a minute?
I'm going to take this time for a second from the gentleman from California just to say that, first of all, I wish I could speak like the gentleman from California and express the views that he just expressed the way he just expressed them. And I'm always in awe of your ability to do so, and thank you for it, because it's really important. And I would just offer, and it bears repeating, in the context of speech and engagement in the public square, that the gentleman, Mr. Smith, whose daughter was assaulted in a restroom in the school he sent her to be protected in, was at the school board meeting in question and was then approached and was told that, quote, we've heard it several times tonight from our public speakers, but the predator student simply does not exist. And that after that exchange, Smith was approached by a woman who's a frequent poster in an anti-racist parents group in Loudoun County, and said they were compiling a watch list with names, addresses, and employment information of parents who opposed woke school policies. And Smith told the organization that he tried to explain what happened to his daughter, and she looked me dead in the eyes and said, that's not what happened. This to a man whose daughter had been assaulted, and he's at the school board meeting, and he's trying to have his grievance heard, and then he had the force of law enforcement, local law enforcement, step over his ability to speak there in the parents in the school board meeting, and now my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to federalize that as domestic terrorism. That is the problem. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. If there are no further speakers, the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in nature of a substitute? If not, the question occurs. The gentleman is recognized.
Move strike the last word on the underlying, yeah.
Gentleman is recognized.
So I did want to add also into the record, and I'll submit these all later, all of these that I've been adding to the record, I'll bring to the chairman, that it bears noting that a Loudoun County judge just in the last week removed the fairly notably leftist Commonwealth's attorney from the case regarding his daughter's sexual assault, and the case regarding the dad with respect to the sexual assault of his daughter. The judge removed the liberal Loudoun County Commonwealth's attorney, Buddha Bibaraj, from an appeal case citing concerns over impartiality. So without objection, I'd like to insert that into the record.
Without objection.
And I think that this is just an important another piece of all of this, if you're following the facts on this and why this does in fact matter. And I'm not gonna repeat much of what we've already now, I think, gone over in the context of the amendment to the underlying measure. But I do want to just reiterate that we're talking about a request of information by the Congress of the United States, Article 1 from the executive branch, and that we are forced, in the absence of an agreement by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, of the importance of Article 1, checking Article 2 to understand what occurred. We are forced to rely only on the Freedom of Information Act information that we're able to get through outside organizations, rather than carrying out our responsibility and duty in the House Judiciary Committee to oversee the Department of Justice in what should raise clear alarm bells, regardless of one's views about the motives of the Attorney General. We should at least be concerned on a bipartisan basis of a coordination of outside group at the Department of Justice and the White House that results in the highlighting of a particular parent, as was done in this particular memorandum, and then the threat tag being issued subsequent to that, in very clear coordination by the dates and all the evidence before us. We'd all agree, objectively, in a court of law, if you had this evidence, that we should all be concerned on a bipartisan basis about this. This is simply a request of information. I want all the American people who are seeing what's happening today, whether it was with respect to the affidavit, whether it's respect to this issue, whether it's respect to the state of the border, whether it's with respect to the consequences of the border and the various matters before us, these are simply requests of information from the executive branch by the Article 1 legislative branch. And with that, I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the voice vote to affirm my amendment, and I just wanted to bring back the purpose of the amendment with respect to this resolution, because it's been suggested that the origin of the Department of Justice's concern about threats and violence against school board members somehow just came from the School Board Association, but in fact, it came from speech, and not the type of glowing speech, you know, the exchange of opinions in the public square, but speech like this. Brenda, I'm going to gut you like a fat effing pig when I find you. Your mother is an ugly communist whore. If she doesn't quit or resign before the end of the year, we will kill her, but first we will kill you. Or people who know who you are, they will effing see your head swinging from a pole. Now, this is not the exchange of ideas in the public marketplace of ideas. This is criminal conduct. This is threats to do bodily injury, threats to kidnap or injure or kill a person. That is criminal conduct. That is not protected free speech. And in the run-up to the Attorney General's interest in the subject, we saw those kinds of threats against school board members and educators proliferating across the country. And those threats were ugly, and they were not protected speech. They were criminal activity. I yield back.